So our first speaker for today is Laura Kreiling. Laura has a PhD in business management from Paris-Saclay, and she's a policy analyst at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I'm very excited about this presentation because one part of the big mosaic that we're trying to build during this conference is policy. And until now, I've been talking about policy a lot, but now we're going to have a policy-focused presentation that is going to outline the work that the OECD is doing in the field of responsible innovation for neurotechnology. Laura, the field is yours.
Thank you very much, Marcello. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, thank you very much to all prior speakers today. I've learned a lot. I'm not a neuroscientist, as Marcello introduced me. I'm policy analyst at the OECD. I'd like to thank also the organizers, Suryo and his team, for putting this great event together. And I hope to have the chance to meet all of you over the course of later today and tomorrow. So what I've prepared to do in the next 30 minutes is to introduce you to the work that the OECD has been doing in terms of responsible innovation, in particular in the context of neurotechnology. In order to do that, I split my presentation into two parts. So the first one is a bit explaining to you the context of in general, the OECD work on responsive innovation in emerging technologies broadly. And I'll then, in the second part, focus on the sort of key project that I've been working on in the past almost 4 years, which is the implementation of an instrument that the OECD created, which is the OECD recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. So in the second part of my talk, I hope you'll be learning more and understand a bit the development context, the history of where the ideas and the development of this instrument came about, the current implementation efforts that we're undertaking, and I hope that at the end of the talk, there are a few of you here in the room who'd like to stay involved in the sort of co-development of these tools that I'll outline to you at the very end of my presentation. Right, first things first. I assume some of you have heard of the OECD before. Those who have not, it's an international organization with the vision to create better policies for better lives. So our key community that we're talking to are policymakers. It's an international organization with 38 members based in Paris. Our interlocutors are ministries, and for example, in Germany, it's the Research Ministry or the Industrial Affairs, so BMBF or BMWI ministries. And so there are three in BMBF and BMWI, because I in OECD, I'm situated in the Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation. So there are other parts of OECD, the education part, for example. Some of you have heard of the PISA statistics. So there are other colleagues of mine who work with other parts of government. But where I'm situated in OECD is the Science, Technology, Innovation part, and particularly in a working party that I'll explain to you in a second. But the three functionalities of why OECD exists and what we do is primarily to conduct research and analysis on empirical insights that we see in member countries. We're convening events in order to facilitate exchanges across members. And then we are also developing international, what we call soft law, in many policy fields. And this is the part that I'll explain to you, taking the example of the recommendation on responsible innovation neurotechnology. So my group that I'm working in as a policy analyst at OECD is a working party that's a subunit within our STI directorate, and we focus on policy issues related to bio, nano, and converging technologies. So we look at, for example, issues around the bioeconomy, technology convergence, and the increased complexity in systems approaches. And one of the topics that we focus on in our work is to look at technology governance in the context of responsible innovation. So what do we mean with that? It's about trustworthy technology development, which is guided by democratic values, responsive to social needs, as well as accountable to society. And that's our definition of responsible innovation. And together with social outcomes of technology, this depends on good technology governance. There could be a separate talk that I could give here today in which I could lay out the ideas that we put around good technology governance, but my focus will be rather on these instruments, which is why in the next slide I'll just outline the sort of key ideas that sit within our approach to anticipatory emerging technology governance on this slide now, and then I'll leave you with 2 references of publications that already exist if you want to dive deeper into those issues. So the key idea when we talk about anticipatory emerging technology governance is that we look at the innovation process in itself and we are trying to make it more anticipatory, inclusive, and purposive. And what we mean with that is purposive is a word to describe directional, like, for example, the creation of missions or mission-oriented innovation policy. And the idea is to help shape technological designs and trajectories without unduly constraining innovations. We've heard at a couple of talks today resentments and issues where sort of regulation is stifling innovation. And the idea using these anticipatory approaches is to try to navigate what the literature is referring to as the Kreiling dilemma. And that's the timing, that's a concept that is trying to describe the timing of when to best regulate. So regulating too early, as we heard, is stifling innovation, and there the full consequences of a technology development might not be apparent. There might be undue regulations that can constrain innovation, but when you regulate too late, and that's what Sumner also referred to in his talk just now, is that changing course might not be possible anymore because they entrenched things already in the system that make it like end-of-pipe solutions too late. So there are three capacities that we are sort of going into developing and help governments develop. So these are approaches around anticipation and foresight, we refer to as strategic intelligence, the integration across disciplines, and also looking at mechanisms or approaches around public engagement. There is one institution that was created end of last year, which had a very exciting inaugural event earlier this year in June, which is called the OECD Global Forum on Technology. The idea here is that the idea of this institution is that it's supposed to be a venue for a regular in-depth dialogue between members and also non-member countries to get ahead of long-term opportunities and risks presented by technologies. So this is a super broad statement, but what we've done as a first step is to identify 3 emerging technology areas for which we're looking to look into challenges that exist and how to embed good governance in those. And these are immersive technologies, synthetic biology, and quantum technologies. And they are not neurotechnology and AI because the OECD has already done work on them, and I'll, in the next part of my presentation, explain you a bit more on that. So on neurotechnology, there are 2, actually the first presentation that some of you in those in BCI, and I think many of you are working on BCI themselves, could be interested in this publication, which is about brain-computer interfaces, and it looked at the governance system that exists. So it, for example, describes the existence of different upstream governance mechanisms, like soft laws, standardization, ethics by design approaches, corporate self-governance, or participatory experiments, and it presents case studies and examples of those types of mechanisms existing that we have seen in OECD countries. And this paper has also been a background to a recommendation by the OECD that looks at agile regulatory governance to harness innovation, which has come out of a different part of the OECD that's not located in the STI directorate. So I'm not best placed to talk about this on regulatory issues, and it's certainly not on this recommendation, but just to put it into context, this BCI paper from my colleagues influenced some of these anticipatory mechanisms that are then reflected in this recommendation. To your right-hand side, there's work which I co-authored with my boss and some other colleagues, which is sort of giving a first indication of the sort of key aspects that we see that need to be part of our emergent technology governance framework. The idea, again, is to look at upstream design criteria and tools. So there are design criteria around anticipation, inclusion, and adaptivity. And at the same time to match them with policy tools. So what could a policymaker do to implement that? Forward-looking technology assessment, upstream societal engagement, and the co-development of soft law. And this third point, the co-development of soft law, is the point that I'd like to go a bit deeper in my presentation now with you. So here on this slide, you see 3 examples of OECD recommendations, which are examples of this so-called soft law. The third is the one I just referred to on the agile regulatory governance. And the other 2, the one on neurotechnology and the other one on AI, are the ones that I'll explain to you in a bit more detail on my next slides. Before I do that, though, I know that I'm not talking to a policy audience here, so I just inserted this slide to give you a brief definition of what an OECD recommendation is and why it is different to a regulatory instrument. So the idea is that it's an international agreed set of policy or general recommendations, principles, and best practices. And it's called soft law because it means that it's not legally binding, but it still is a political commitment to implement the ideas that are embodied in this in the instrument. There is an expectation of the adherents of to the recommendation that they will do their utmost to implement the principles and ideas that are embedded in there, and the implementation is can be reviewed, and it focuses also on peer learning and the exchange of best practices. And these points I think you will sort of see when I take you through the work that we've been doing on the neurotechnology recommendation. Just to say, yes, I'll be now talking about 2 of those recommendations, but there are actually nowadays 177 out there that the OECD created and that they are regularly reviewing that can be accessed via the website. So I'll be focusing now on explaining to you a bit what this AI recommendation, neurotech recommendation say. Right, let's focus first on the AI recommendation. This is done by a team of colleagues of mine, so all the following slides are, I give credit to my colleagues in the digital economy policy team. The AI recommendation was the first intergovernmental standard on AI, which was adopted in May 2019 by all 38 member countries and also partner countries to the OECD, and it influenced, for example, the G20 AI principles that I assume many of you have heard about in 2019, which have drawn on the ideas that are embodied in what we refer to as AI principles. There are a set of 10 principles which are split into 2 parts. 5 focus on values-based principles for trustworthy human-centric AI, and then there are 5 principles which are more targeted to policymakers that set out how national policies could be and ecosystems built to benefit society. So I'll now zoom in a bit on those 5 values-based principles, because this session today here is now about ethics. And the idea is to lay out this in this really nice mapping by my colleagues, how these high-level principles are then translated into sub-principles and in concrete indicators and initiatives that could be done. So, for example, so the 5 values-based principles are inclusive growth, sustainable development, and well-being, the first one. The second one is human-centered values and fairness. The third is transparency and explainability. 4th is robustness, security, and safety, and then accountability. And so each of these high-level values-based principles is then broken down into sub-principles. So let's pick the second part on values and fairness. And then there are specific indicators that could be action, such as creating an initiative targeted at reducing AI bias. Or for accountability, there are examples of creating a code of ethical conduct and practical technological tools, or to establish independent oversight bodies auditing algorithm use. So there's a really cool platform for all of you interested on finding out what's the pulse of things on AI, which is called the OECD AI Observatory. It's you can reach it on your browsers by scanning the code or just tapping oecd.ai, and it's a platform that was created to share and shape public policies for responsible, trustworthy, and beneficial AI, in which it explains more on those AI principles that I just sort of highlighted. It gives you country-level information on the state of AI in countries. So you get country fact sheets. There's a huge repository of initiatives that are existing on the country level. There's work done around AI policy areas. There are expert groups that are convened by the OECD. There's a really cool blog in which some experts discuss hot topics. So this is a really great resource. All of you interested in AI. Latest trends and things, go there, and I think that's a great resource. This does not yet exist for the neurotech context, but I'll get to our vision and how we're hoping to maybe able to build this. Right, so let us now move to the second part of my talk, which is the recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. And I'll start off with giving you a bit of history on how the development journey of this recommendation came about, and that this has not just fallen from the sky or come out of nowhere. But first of all, what is this recommendation? It's just as the AI recommendation, it is the first international standard, in this case on responsive innovation in neurotechnology, and it was created to guide governments and innovators to anticipate and address ethical, legal, and social challenges raised by health-related neurotechnologies. and while promoting innovation. So the idea is to, as I said earlier, to have this sort of innovation process approach, provide guidance at each step of the innovation process, starting from research, technology transfer, investment, commercialization, and regulation, so that benefits are maximized and risks minimized. That's the idea. So it's really an instrument that's not only targeted at policymakers, and we see that when we talk later about the implementation of the tool. But here's a bit of the history of how this was created, and this was before my time at OECD. At the time I was doing my PhD, but you saw that my colleagues who were involved in the creation of this instrument, which came to adoption in December 2019, convened a set of expert consultations, workshops, and events in which they discussed what should be the responsive innovation principles that need to be embodied in this instrument, which led to the adoption of this. There's a host of OECD analytical work that went into specific issues that are being addressed now in the recommendation, which you see some examples here on this slide. But let's now talk a bit about the content. What does it say in this instrument? So the recommendation consists of 9 principles. There's one chapeau or one umbrella principle that's about promoting responsive innovation in neurotechnology to address health challenges. So again, emphasizing the health focus. And then all the other 8 principles are more subject specific. So what I mean here is the second one is about prioritizing, assessing safety in the development, or promoting the inclusivity of neurotechnology. Fostering scientific collaboration is one I think that could be of interest to many of you here in the room today. Enabling societal deliberation on neurotechnology, capacity of oversight and advisory bodies. It looks at safeguarding personal brain data, promotion of cultures and of stewardship and trust across the public and private sectors. And the 9th principle is one that I think Niels Birnbaum today earlier alluded to towards the end of his talk, which talks about the issue of misuse. So anticipating and monitoring potential unintended uses and or misuse of neurotechnology. So just going from those topics on principles to some real concrete examples, what does this instrument actually say in terms of language? I selected 2 principles which I thought could be of interest to you here today. One principle, the third principle is about promoting inclusivity of neurotechnology, and then it stipulates in sort of sub-principles what this further means. So the first sub-principle says, striving to ensure neurotechnology is both developed for and available to those in need, promoting an enabling environment that advances inclusion of underrepresented populations, taking into account diversity of cultures and strive to minimize inequality in the development and use of neurotechnology. So these are the sort of the types of normative statements that are embodied in those sub-principles. And in the final part of my talk, I'll explain to you how we go about trying to put those into practice with the different recommendation stakeholder groups. Now, I think principle 7 is also quite an interesting one, and many of the talks that we heard here today focus on the use and the processing of brain data, but how to safeguard the brain data that you as researchers or that companies are dealing with. In the sub-principles, we lay out that providing clear information to the public and to research participants about the collection, storage, processing, potential use of the brain data collected, ensuring the means of obtaining consent are adequate, promoting opportunities for individuals to choose how their data are used and shared, promoting confidentiality and privacy and mitigate security breaches, including through the implementation of security standards. So it's a bit what we just heard in the talk before the break on some of the approaches that could be used there. And ensuring not only traceability of data collected, processed, but also medical acts in which neurotechnology is used. So after having zoomed in on the sort of legal language of those principles, let me talk to you in my final part of my presentation a bit on the implementation work that we've been doing to enact and roll out the ideas that are embodied in this instrument. So here on this slide, which is a bit hard to read, I'm sorry for the projector, you see the OECD member countries. You can look them up on Wikipedia on our page. So the 38 member countries are what we refer to as the adherents, because they are the ones that ratified and accepted the the instrument, plus Brazil, who is now a aspiring member accession country, they also signed up to this recommendation. So this is what we refer to as the recommendation adherence, and they have a responsibility to implement this recommendation, as I explained to you in my definition of the recommendation as an instrument. So 5 years after adoption, there's a formal monitoring. So we need to report back to OECD Council if this instrument is still relevant, if it's been used. And so what we're doing with our implementation efforts is to prepare this sort of monitoring, that's one aspect of it, and to generally build capacity among adherents, but also other recommendation stakeholders. And this part about other recommendation stakeholders is really important for this neurotechnology recommendation, because as you know, neurotech innovation is happening not only inside governments, it's actually happening in research labs in companies. So there are these two other really important groups we also need to target with our implementation efforts. So what are we doing and what are our objectives? So you see that on the left-hand side, translating these norms into practice by creating tools and guidance resources. This is what I'll be talking to you about at the very end of my talk today. We are holding workshops, events, and publications to disseminate and create awareness about the existence of the recommendation and the dissemination to stakeholders. So this is what we're doing here today. I hope at the end of this talk you're aware that the recommendation exists and you are hopefully interested to learn more and to think about how to include those ideas into your daily practices, and then to prepare the reporting to council, which is more an activity we need to do with those recommendation adherents. So let me talk to you a bit about what we've been doing in the last 4 years, since 2020. So we have been holding a series of events in which we deep dived into some of those principles and ideas. COVID hit, as you all know, 2020. So most of the events we wanted to do in person, we had to somehow then convene remotely. We've teamed up as well, for example, with the Council of Europe, in which we had an event in which we looked at the question of the human rights framework, and if there is a need for new rights. So if you're interested in the outcomes of what came out of this conversation, I embedded a link to the full report on my slide. We held OECD conferences and had panels in there in which we talked about harnessing responsible neurotechnology for brain health. There also was, I am highlighting this workshop here on this dedicated slide because it was the most recent event which took place in July last year, where we teamed up with BrainMind, which is an ecosystem that exists primarily in the United States, in which we had a fairly small but very interesting, intense discussion, in which we deep dived into two principles, the stewardship and trust principle and inclusivity, and we discussed the sort of ethical, legal, and social issues in neurotech innovation, advancing justice, promoting public goods, encouraging and rebuilding trust, prioritizing public engagement, defining key terms and aspirations, moving beyond virtues to create tangible actions, and creating realistic incentive structures to do so. From our OECD side, we then have taken a couple of key points away from this meeting. One was, for me, this slide, which actually showed us that the recommendation stakeholder groups are much broader than the policy audience with which we have developed this recommendation. And a key thing that we also learned when we discussed the sort of issues on how to translate the norms into practice is that just doing it the way we would do this to policymakers wouldn't work with others. So we need to tailor the communication in which we design the tools to embed those implementation ideas. And this is what I'll focus on in the just final slides of my talk. So the implementation efforts for us are in sort of 3 pillars: the building of tools, the monitoring, and the analysis. And I think 2 parts of it are interesting for you. One is about the analysis side, looking at what are national implementation initiatives that we've seen in countries. So I have 1 slide on that for you. And then the final part will be showing you some sneak peeks of the tools that we're building to support recommendation stakeholders and to explain to you how you could be getting involved if you're interested. So on the analysis side, we are starting to see national examples, what countries are doing to implement the recommendation. And it's been very diverse. So it's pretty impressive and really fascinating for us to hear from our delegates in the respective, mostly ministries, the types of things that have been happening in countries. So let's pick Germany, because we're all here in Germany today. The BMBF revised or created a new funding guideline that came out earlier this year, which embodies some ideas from the recommendation, for example, in the way how they put out funding calls, requiring, for example, those with new research projects to embody some deliberative processes, for example, in the project. Then we have France. France has created an institutional mechanism. They created a French charter in which they convened their national neuro ecosystem. They talked to the researchers, to the companies, and they basically derived a synthesis of those 9 principles. They picked and chose those that they felt were working in the French system, and then they created an instrument to which they have now, I think, almost 30 institutions that have signed up to the instrument, and it's constantly evolving and also now starting a discussion on the European level where there's a European charter needed. Then we have Japan, a pretty exciting example we came across right before the summer, and which is more in the realm of public communication. So they created a handbook targeted to the general public on the state of neuroscience research and also to companies with responsible innovation ideas. And they actually did the things that they highlight in the handbook mapped against some of the ideas that are in the recommendation. And fourthly, we have an example from Canada earlier this year. There was a symposium in which they discussed their sort of national strategy on how to best develop the ecosystem there. And Jennifer, who is here today, she participated in the panel, so you can ask her more about what's happening in Canada and how they are looking to embed the recommendation in their national context. Right. Last part of my talk is now I give you a couple of examples how this tool development has been going. And I alluded to it. So we currently have this huge repository we internally refer to as our telephone book, because it's this huge document that's never going to be published in the world because nobody would read it. It's a repository of possible actions and practices and resources that we are now working with in order to tailor it in toolkits that are usable to governments, to industry, and to academia, which are our 3 main stakeholder groups. And I'll give you examples of how we're looking to do this. So the most advanced of those 3 tools is the policy toolkit. For obvious reasons, because we primarily talk to policy audiences, we prioritized this toolkit. And so we, together with our delegates that we work with on a regular basis, we decided on the overall outline and structure of how this tool will work. So we're retaining the 9 principal structures, and then we sort of lay out in individual principal pages possible actions that policymakers could do, pitfalls they need to avoid, and also examples of relevant practices and resources, so reports that are out there or otherwise. And then you can further drill down into different policy actions that you say you want to develop guidance on the brain data storage. So you would then select the respective principle and then click on the policy action area. And there also might be a module in which we let policymakers self-assess the actions that are stipulated and to assess the extent to which this is done in their countries. So how could this work? Here's a quick mock-up. The tool does not exist. So this is pretty exciting, just for you to give you an idea on how the sort of policymaker user would navigate through this. They would select the respective topic that's embodied in the principles. Let's say they want to know more on the chapeau, the general responsible innovation principle. They would then get to a principle page, and then they say, okay, in terms of responsible innovation, if I want to develop a guidance, what would I need to consider to potentially do? And then they would present it with a set of points to consider or possible action statements. And one of them is maybe one that may speak to some of you, because it tells policymakers, hey, you could encourage clinicians through guidance to prioritize the use of technologies that have been assessed for ethical dimensions. So risks to individuals' autonomy, capacity, predilections in decision-making in unanticipated ways. So this is just one example of how this sort of tool would break down the ideas from the recommendation principle into a possible action for a policymaker wanting to implement this. Now, turning to the industry toolkit, which is the second in line for us in terms of the development, here's the sort of conceptual ideas that we have sort of been settling on. One is that within the industry ecosystem, there are companies, there are investors, there are NGOs, professional societies, and they all think and work and differently, which means there needs to be a way that they first of all self-identify in the tool to then get targeted information that speaks to them. So that's the one thing. The other thing is that the 9 principles, these ideas that I just laid out to you, I assume they have not really spoken to many of you. So we need to somehow thematically group them, that they are presented in a way that that they match with corporate functions, or that they work better with the way how industry actors work. And then the third one is that we need to co-create this. We can't just with our policy head create something that's supposed to be useful for companies or for investors, but we need to co-develop this with you. So on the orange side here, I tried to sort of show this sort of couple of possible actions and pitfalls that we already have gathered and examples to that. But our idea is to crowdsource more of it. So to create a resource that features maybe some examples that we heard from Samna just in his talk, or from maybe something that you know. And the other part is about potentially creating a module that allows you to self-assess. And this is something which doesn't exist yet. So it could be an opportunity to co-develop this as an interactive module with you. And we're looking to this via workshops and advisory groups. So here, I don't know how much more time I have, Marcello, but I'm 3 minutes over time. So then I'll explain to you how we have been going from, I have just 2 more slides, from the industry guidance to a thematic grouping that sort of lays out investment, corporate, the creation of corporate charters, research and development, ethical standards, communication and data practices. I'll go into this during the panel discussion, so I'll just skip over it now. And my last slide is just to lay out sort of next steps to sort of show you a bit where we are heading. So from my talk just now, it became pretty obvious that so far we've been focusing efforts on the policy and the industry toolkit. So we already have an agreed outline and structure of the policy toolkit. We are working together with our OECD delegates to now create concrete principle pages to implement it technically, because we have a big ministerial meeting coming up in April next year in which we want to launch this toolkit. So in 1 year's time, I will be able to give you a live demo of this toolkit. And on the industry side, we have this initial structure and outline that I showed to you. There's a workshop coming up at the Brain Mind Summit in San Francisco, where we're going to workshop some of those ideas that will be presented in the toolkit. And there's more work to do on prototyping and outlining this. But the message I want to leave you all with is, because these tools are in the development pipeline, there's an opportunity to get involved. And I would really encourage you, if you found this interesting, or if you want to chat more about it, to contact me. There are 2 primary ways to become involved: either to sign up to an advisory group that we'll create for industry or academia audiences, or to help us crowdsource more actions and possible examples by doing that remotely, if you, depending on your availability of time and capacity. So we hope that all of these 3 toolkits will eventually feed into a Neuro-Policy Observatory that we are currently discussing with our delegates, if there is interest to do this. But we certainly have the vision to eventually have a resource that will feature all of these toolkits in a super visible way and is as exciting as the OECD Policy Observatory that I talked about earlier in my talk. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the panel discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for giving us this extremely informative crash course on technology policy at the OECD. And Laura is a very humble, but should really emphasize how pioneering the OECD was in the field of neurotechnology policy. They set the first standard in the field, and they started working on the topic before it was cool, at least before it was mainstream in the field of technology policy. And Laura was really the perpetual engine that made this possible over the last few years. So we have decided to, so we are going to have a panel discussion later today where you have the opportunity to ask questions. But since the next speaker happens to be myself, and I will need some time to set up the slides, Pim, please ask your question to Laura.
Thanks.
I can bring it to you.
Thanks. I know it's horrible here, but they make recordings, so that's why we need the microphone. Thanks. That was really great. I have only one question, and so that is, I mean, in a way, all these descriptions of the values and what you have to do is providing information about how to do it well, right? But I think for many cases, and I'm talking from some experience in AI, it's not that people don't know what they should be doing. It's just that they're not doing it because there's better things to do, such as making money. And so an important question, the second half of your story that you sometimes alluded to but didn't specify very much, is what do you do to ensure an enforcement of all these instructions and good principles? Because we have already on a mountain of ethical codes and good instructions and translations of principles and ethical design structures and frameworks. The problem is mostly in checking whether people stick to it and what you do when they don't do it. And just one example, in the Netherlands we have a authority, personal data, and they are complaining continuously because they don't have enough people to take even all the complaints into account about violations. So the problem seems to be more on the other side than the side that you explained so well. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing there?
Sure. Yes, of course. So I explained in my presentation that these recommendations are normally built for policy audiences, which is why from our sort of corporate, the monitoring side of these recommendations are primarily targeted to the adherence of the recommendations, because there have not been many recommendations. I think the AI and Neurotech are the first ones in which there are broader stakeholder groups to which the ideas are, supposed to be translated, embedded, and ideally also accountability mechanisms created. At the moment, OECD does not monitor the implementation in those other stakeholder groups. So there's just this formal reporting that we asked of countries and the reporting that we need to do back to Council. So ideally in this reporting, the countries would also explain to us, let's say French, the charter, they would be answering how companies have been implementing this. But at the moment, there's no mechanisms that we've identified in which OECD would be able to assess the extent to which a company complies to these ideas. So there are currently discussions on the extent to which there might be the possibility to create a label or something, so that a company who, let's say, signs up to a certain charter, let's say the French charter that was created, it's the only one that exists today, but in the future there might be a European charter. But then there need to be accountability mechanisms to check that these things that they have signed up to are actually done in practice. But OECD is not the type of institution that would be giving an OECD certificate to it. I think there needs to be there is a void today that you've tapped into, which is the fact that this doesn't exist yet for these other stakeholder groups. And I hope that part of our dissemination activities, and your point now here is well taken, is that something that will be created, that governments will help to create, because they need to understand that the ideas embodied in this particular instrument are broader than just to a policy audience. So we need to create those mechanisms. So I'm fully with you. But in all disclosure, this doesn't exist yet today, and we hope to create it and see this coming in the future.
All right, so if there are more questions, please keep them in mind for the panel discussion, which is going to be shortly after the next